In 1420, the Pope declared a crusade. The target was not the Holy Land. The target was a small kingdom in Central Europe, Bohemia, roughly the area of the modern Czech Republic. The army that answered the crusade call was enormous. Knights from across the Holy Roman Empire, mercenaries from a dozen countries, veterans of real crusades to the east, they outnumbered the Bohemian defenders by a wide margin. They had better weapons, better armor, better horses, better everything. The Bohemians were mostly farmers and craftsmen, many of them armed with nothing more than agricultural tools. The crusade was crushed. They sent a second crusade. It was also crushed. Then a third. Then a fourth. Then a fifth. The peasant army of Bohemia defeated 5 papal crusades in 15 years. They did it using tactics that had never been seen before in European warfare, led by a commander who may have been the most innovative military mind of the medieval period, and driven by a religious conviction so absolute that it made them functionally impossible to demoralize. This is the story of the Hussites. To understand the Hussites, you need to understand Jan Hus. Jan Hus was a Czech priest and university rector in Prague who, in the early 15th century, began preaching something that the Catholic Church found deeply dangerous. He said that the Church had become corrupt. He said that the Pope was not above Scripture. He said that ordinary Christians should receive communion in both kinds, bread and wine, rather than just the bread that the Church had reserved for the clergy. He said these things in Czech to Czech congregations in one of the most important cities in Central Europe. The Church had heard this kind of criticism before and had generally dealt with it by burning the critics. In 1415, Jan Hus was summoned to the Council of Constance, which was one of the most important church councils of the medieval period, convened to resolve a crisis in which 3 men simultaneously claimed to be the rightful pope. Hus was given a safe conduct guarantee, an official promise of protection, to attend and present his views. The council burned him anyway. The reaction in Bohemia was explosive. Hus had been enormously popular. He was not just a religious reformer. He was a Czech nationalist icon at a time when Bohemia was increasingly dominated by German-speaking nobility and clergy. His burning was not just a theological offense. It was an ethnic insult. Within 4 years, the situation had escalated into outright rebellion. In 1419, a group of Hussites, followers of Hus's teachings, threw several Catholic city councillors out of the windows of the Prague town hall in what became known as the First Defenestration of Prague. This was the beginning of the Hussite Wars. The Holy Roman Emperor, Sigismund of Luxembourg, who was also the King of Bohemia, appealed to the Pope. The Pope declared a crusade. Christendom was to be mobilized to crush this heresy before it spread. What the Crusaders found when they arrived in Bohemia in 1420 was not the disorganized rabble they expected. Jan Žižka had been organizing them. Jan Žižka is one of the most remarkable military commanders in history, a man who fundamentally changed how armies fight and who achieved his greatest victories after he was completely blind. He had one eye when the wars began and lost the other to an arrow during a siege in 1421. He continued commanding from that point onward, blind, relying on his staff to describe the terrain to him, and he continued winning. Žižka understood that his peasant army could not beat the heavily armored knights of the Crusade in open field combat. They lacked the training, the equipment, and the horses. But he also understood that medieval armies were not very good at attacking prepared positions, and that the Bohemian peasants were intensely motivated in a way that mercenary knights were not. His solution was the Wagenburg, the wagon fort. The Wagenburg was not a new idea. Armies had used wagons as field fortifications before, but Žižka systematized it, refined it, and turned it into a complete tactical doctrine that no European army had seen executed at this level. The Hussite wagons were modified farm carts. They were reinforced with wood and iron. They had openings for handguns. The Hussites were early adopters of gunpowder weapons, and for crossbows. The wagons were chained together to form a continuous wall around the Hussite army. Behind that wall, the infantry stood in organized formations. Artillery, including some of the heaviest guns in Europe at the time, was positioned to fire through gaps. The crusading knights would advance. The Hussite guns and crossbows would cut them down from behind the wagon walls. When the knights retreated or broke formation, the Hussite cavalry would emerge from the wagon fort and run them down. This was not passive defense. The wagon fort was a mobile platform for offensive action. It could be assembled on a march in under an hour. It gave the Hussites the ability to choose their ground, to force the enemy to attack on unfavorable terms, and to transform defensive firepower into offensive pursuit. The First Crusade in 1420 collapsed at the Battle of Vítkov Hill. Žižka had positioned his forces on a ridge outside Prague with his wagons forming an impenetrable wall. The Crusaders assaulted the position, were repulsed with heavy losses, and retreated. Sigismund's massive, expensive, international army dissolved. The Second Crusade in 1421 met similar results. The Third Crusade in 1422 was routed at the Battle of Nemeki Broad. The Crusaders were not just defeated, they were humiliated. Well-equipped professional soldiers were being beaten by people who weeks before had been growing crops. By the Fourth Crusade, the mere approach of a Hussite army caused crusading forces to break and run. This phenomenon, called the Hussite Panic, or Hussite Terror, was described by contemporary chroniclers as a kind of supernatural fear that overcame otherwise brave men at the sound of the Hussite war wagon wheels and the singing of their battle hymns. The Hussites marched into battle singing. They had a battle hymn called Ktoś Jezu Boży Bojownicy, Who are the warriors of God? It was probably the most famous song in Europe for most of the 15th century. It described the Hussites as soldiers of God fighting for his truth, promising that those who died for God's law would receive eternal reward. Armies hearing it across the field knew they were about to fight people who genuinely did not fear dying. That is a psychological weapon of enormous force. Žižka died in 1424 during a siege of plague. He was blind, old, and had spent 4 years winning every engagement he entered. Before he died, he reportedly requested that his skin be made into a drum so that his army could take him into battle one final time. There is no evidence the request was granted, but the fact that the story was told and believed says something about the relationship between this commander and his men. After Žižka, command passed to a Hussite priest named Prokop the Great, who was arguably an even more aggressive strategist. If Žižka built the system, Prokop used it to go on offense. The Hussites began conducting raids, called the Beautiful Rides, deep into German, Austrian, and Hungarian territory. They were no longer just defending Bohemia. They were carrying the war to their enemies, burning towns, taking plunder, demonstrating that the movement could not be contained. German cities paid tribute to avoid being raided. The Hussite wagon forts rolled through territories that had sent armies to destroy them. The Fifth Crusade was declared in 1431. It was the largest yet. The papal legate leading it commanded a force of perhaps 90,000 men from across the empire. They advanced into Bohemia. At the approach of the Hussite army, the crusade disintegrated. The Crusaders heard the distant sound of the Hussite war wagons and the singing of the battle hymn, and they ran. The chronicler Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, who later became Pope Pius II, wrote that he saw no enemy, suffered no attack, yet the whole Christian army fled in panic. 90,000 men ran from an army they had not yet seen. The Fifth Crusade never fought a battle. It simply ceased to exist. After 5 crusades had failed, the church did something it rarely did. It negotiated. The Council of Basel in 1436 produced the Compacts of Basel, a formal agreement between the church and the Hussites that granted the Bohemians the right to receive communion in both kinds, confirmed certain religious reforms, and effectively recognized that the Crusades had failed to accomplish their purpose. The Hussites got what they wanted, not everything. Bohemia would continue to be contested religiously for another century, but the core demand, the communion cup, was conceded. The thing that Jan Hus had been burned for suggesting in 1415 was official church policy in Bohemia by 1436. The Hussite Wars had one more chapter. Having defeated 5 external crusades, the Hussite movement tore itself apart internally. The moderate Hussites, the Utraquists, who wanted communion in both kinds and manageable reforms, came into conflict with the radical Hussites. The Taborites, who wanted to tear down the entire existing social and religious order. In 1434, at the Battle of Lipany, the moderate Hussites allied with the Catholic nobility to crush the Taborites. Prokop the Great was killed in the battle. The radical wing of the movement that had defeated 5 crusades was destroyed by its own former allies. That is a pattern you see repeatedly in the history of revolutionary movements. The external enemy cannot defeat them. The internal conflict eventually can. What the Hussites left behind was enormous. Their tactical innovations, the Wagenburg system, the use of combined arms, the integration of gunpowder weapons into a coherent defensive-offensive doctrine, influenced European warfare for a century. Their theological positions, that scripture superseded church authority, that the laity deserved full communion, that the church needed reform, prefigured the Protestant Reformation by 100 years. Martin Luther himself acknowledged his debt to Jan Hus. When Luther was accused of heresy in 1521, 100 years after Hus was burned, he reportedly responded, "We are all Hussites now." The peasant army of Bohemia did not just defeat 5 crusades. It planted a seed that would eventually split Western Christianity permanently. Jan Hus was burned for ideas that, a century later, half of Europe believed. Jan Žižka never lost a battle. He remains the only commander in recorded history never to have been defeated in the field. The Wagon, the War Hymn, and the Communion Cup. 3 simple things. Against the full military power of the medieval church, the peasants won.